St. Patrick's Day is, of course, an Irish American thing. It's not an Italian thing. So maybe it's just a case of irony that one of the most famous Italian Americans in New England history happens to celebrate his birthday on St. Patrick's Day. What if I told you that Don Raymond Patriarca was born on St. Patrick's Day in 1908? And also, he wasn't even born in Providence. He is associated as being like the king of Providence, the king of Federal Hill, of Atwell's Avenue. But he was actually born in Worcester. And if you're not from Massachusetts, you probably pronounce it Worcester. But anyways, he was born there and he lived there till he was 3 years old. He was born to two Italian-American immigrant parents. And instead of eating corned beef and cabbage and drinking green beer on St. Patty's Day, they were welcomed in their baby boy Raymond. Now, it might be perceived from things that you read that Raymond was born into maybe kind of a well-to-do family that maybe had some money or some influence from the old world, but this isn't necessarily the case. So you might get the impressions in some of the writings about Raymond that he came from maybe a family that was kind of well-to-do, or they had some money, or maybe they came over from the old world with some sort of influence. But this really wasn't the case. Like I said, they were like just a step above peasants. His father, was a hardworking, honest man. But then during Prohibition, during the 1920s, he started to get involved in illegal bootlegging of alcohol. And I'm not sure if he was involved in the transporting of it or if he was distilling it and making it in some way, but somehow, way, shape, or form, Raymond's father got involved in violating the Volstead Act, and he made some money from it. And he took this money and he invested some of it, and he bought some land, some decent acreage, and it came in handy for the family later when Raymond found himself in legal problems. His mother was able to sell the land and use the money to pay legal fees and pay for the lawyer, and I believe some of it was put up for bail as well. So tragedy hit the family, unfortunately, when Raymond was 17 years old. His father died in 1925, and Raymond kind of, as soon as his father died, it affected him very deeply, and he pretty much left school almost right after his father died, and he began to drift. Raymond really never was in kind of trouble before his father was alive. He had no criminal record until he was his late teens. He didn't seem to run with gangs. Just seemed like a normal kid. It seemed, like I said, like a normal working class family. His father made some money doing the bootlegging, and then tragedy befell the family, and he died at an early age. And Raymond attributes this to basically how he got involved in the life of crime and how his life went sideways. He says that if his father had never passed away, then like all the stuff that happened to him, that might not have ever happened. Now, if this is true, I don't know, but it definitely, to Raymond, it was a very profound experience, and it was life altering, life changing. So he caught his first case in Greenwich, Connecticut, when he violated the Volstead Act, and he got a month in jail and a $250 fine. But unfortunately, it didn't affect him at all. He did his month in jail, he paid his fine, and he went right back and continued to reoffend. And him and his brother, he had a younger brother, Joseph Patriarca, and early on in life, Joseph was his partner in crime and his closest confidant. And Joseph was always involved in the kind of activities that Raymond was in. So Raymond continued to offend throughout the 20s. He was heavily involved in bootlegging. I don't know if it was connections that he had established through his father when his father had previously bootlegged, and it was people he knew through his father, and he already had these relationships established. I'm not really sure. He was running with the Morellis, Frank Bootsy Morelli and Joe Morelli, who were two brothers out of Rhode Island, and they really weren't organized crime. They were just kind of like a loose crew. They were really wild and unorganized, and they were just basically bootleggers, and they operated all over New England. They were centered out of Rhode Island, but they operated in Massachusetts. They had some stuff going on up in Maine. So they were kind of all over the place, and he ran with them for a while, but then in the late 20s, around 1929, he got hooked up with this guy, Frank Iacone. So Frank Iacone was one of the old school, original Mafia guys. In the late 20s, the New England Mafia like the old school mustache Pete's were starting to get pushed out by the young Turks like Lucky Luciano and these guys. And before the Castamarese War, there was a lot of guys from New York, and they were getting sent out to different cities in the Northeast, and they were trying to set up beachheads in these cities so they could set up like their bootlegging and other illegal operations and funnel the money back to New York City and basically just set up their interest and try to spread their interests throughout the Northeast and beyond. So that's what Frank Iacone was doing in Worcester. He went from New York City to Worcester, and he was reporting back to the New York guys, and once the Castamarese War happened and Lucky Luciano took over and all the old school Mafia guys were out of the picture, Frank Iacone was one of the main guys in Massachusetts, and he had a direct link back to New York City. So in 1929, Raymond got made under Frank Iacone of Worcester, but his allegiance was to New York City because there was no real set New England family at this point. They were just still trying to set up, Lucky Luciano hasn't officially taken control yet. Then after that happens in 1931 or so, they set up the syndicate, and then they actually start appointing bosses and families and stuff like that. But to this point, he's a made member of the Italian Mafia. His allegiance is to New York City, but he's basically under Frank Iacone, and he's dealing with Frank Iacone exclusively. But at this point, the Italian Mafia isn't this huge conglomerate like it was the later half of the 20th century. So even though he's a made member and he probably has a little more prestige on the street, and he's got the backup of the Italian Mafia in New York City, he's still responsible for earning himself. And after the Volstead Act is repealed in the 1930s, these guys lose their main source of income. They were making all their money off of bootlegging and illegal sales of alcohol. So now they got to find new rackets. Raymond's, he's trying to get his money off gambling. He's doing a lot of different things. Him and his brother Joseph, unfortunately, break the federal, it's called the Mann Act. And that is, let me see how I can word this to make it appropriate for YouTube. They're getting women to do things with other men for money, and then they're collecting a percentage of that money. And I think it also involves taking the women across state lines to do this service. So anyways, it's a federal law, so they get charged federally. Him and his brother Joseph Patriarca, like I said, that it was basically his partner in crime. They get charged federally, and they end up going to federal prison for a couple of years. So this is Raymond's first. He's been to county jail before. He's been arrested a bunch of times, but this is his first time going to real prison. He goes to Atlanta prison, which I'm not sure if it's the same federal prison that's in Atlanta today, or if it was some old one, but this was way back in 1930, so I can't imagine that it must have been a fun experience. He's extremely far away from his home and his family. There's no way that they can probably visit him at all. I mean, there was no airplanes and stuff back then. I can't imagine that anyone's going to drive that far. It just must have been a pretty miserable experience. I'm sure there wasn't anybody down there that he would know or was familiar with. I mean, I'm just really thinking about this as I'm talking about it, and it could not have been a pleasant experience whatsoever. So when he got back out on the streets, of course, just like the first time he got arrested, nothing changed with Raymond. If anything, he became more of a hardened criminal, more astute, more kind of probably learned different crimes. It's when you go to prison, it's almost like you're going to criminal college, or they call it con college, and you learn different trades, you learn different tricks, and you just come out a kind of a more well-rounded criminal, if anything else. So once he came out, he was involved in all types of stuff. He was involved in a robbery in Southbridge. He stole a car in Cambridge. He got arrested for being a suspicious person in Providence. He's just basically all over the place trying to do anything he can to make money. He's also, even though he's a made man in the Italian Mafia, he's working as an enforcer, or just doing muscle work for this Irish gangster hoodlum nicknamed Dinky, who was out of Providence. And back then, Providence was still kind of an open city. he really clamped down on free enterprise and made Providence like his city, the Italian mafia city, and basically made all of New England. If you wanted to operate, you had to deal with him and you had to get his blessing and pay tribute. But before that, it was wide open, and there was just as many Irish gangsters and probably other ethnic, but there was a lot of Irish gangsters in Providence as well, especially during Prohibition. So he was doing muscle work, probably collections, if he had to go break a couple legs. Raymond wasn't a big guy, but he was very intense. He physically, I feel like he was tough. People were afraid of him. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, but he just had like this presence about him. You can see in the pictures, he's got these fierce eyes, the brow, the features just like very prominent, like almost like a Roman statue, like the silhouette of his face. You know what I mean? He's got a very like, it's very like, when I look at his face, it makes me think like Roman, like almost like a Roman emperor, like a Caesar. And when he got to the height of his power, that's basically what he was up there on Federal Hill on Atwells Avenue. He was like the Caesar, you know? So, and they said that when he became the boss, they call it the Pax Patriarca, because when Caesar Augustus came, he was I think he was the grandson of Julius Caesar, but when he became the emperor of Rome, there was like a 40-year peace and there was no wars and everything was prosperous and it was a great time, and they call it the Pax Romana, and it meant like the Roman time of peace or whatever. I don't know what the exact Latin translation, but when Raymond became the boss, that's what they called it in New England. They call it the Pax Patriarca because he was such a strong and powerful leader that he brought peace to the land. Not so much in Boston in the 1960s, but that was more of an Irish thing that turned out. And to all the guys who are probably, like, a couple of people left comments in my last video, I hope you're happy that I'm making a video about Raymond Patriarca and something that doesn't have to do with Somerville and Charlestown and the McLaughlins. So I hope this pleases you and this is something different. So moving on anyway, so he was working for the guy Dinky. He got, like I said, he was arrested for all these different things. But at this time, the Providence police and the Rhode Island State Police are all over him. They're arresting him for ridiculous things like rolling dice on a Sunday, because I guess Rhode Island had these like Catholic bylaws because it's a very Catholic state. It still kind of is to this day. There's still a very high Italian and Irish population. Federal Hill, I actually went there a couple summers ago, and it's still like, I mean, of course it's not like it was back when Rain was there though, but it's still very Italian. I went to a couple Italian restaurants while I was there, and went to a cafe for dessert after, an espresso and a cannoli and stuff, and it's just, I don't know, it's, if you've never been to Federal Hill and Atwells Avenue, you should definitely go there. Providence is a really cool city. It's different. It's smaller than Boston, but it's cool, and it hasn't been so friggin' gentrified and yuppified like Boston. It's still almost like going back in time like 20 years. I don't know, I'd take a road trip to Providence if you've never been. So in 1933, Raymond was put on the Rhode Island public enemy list. And this basically was more of like, there wasn't really that many actual implications for this. Like, if he was seen driving after dark, he could be pulled over and arrested. But this was basically more to kind of jam him up and embarrass him, if anything. There wasn't any, like I said, any real like legal ramifications that came with it. It was just, he was on the radar of the Rhode Island State Police and the Providence Police, and they were trying to jam him up, and they were trying to make his life difficult and embarrass him to a certain degree. Now, most people have the image of Don Raymond, like sitting in front of the coin-o-matic with his white stockings, smoking a cigar, waving at people driving by and walking by, or sitting behind the desk and people making payments to him, or him ordering hits and stuff, and, as the Don, as the powerful leader. But when he was the young guy, he was putting in work. I mean, he was out there on the streets. He was a very, very experienced burglar. He said that the happiest he ever was when he was out there on the streets clipping. He enjoyed just being like a common everyday thief and criminal. He enjoyed that stuff. It wasn't like he was trying to get involved in this just to be a boss and to get to the top. Like, he really was about that life. He was a gangster's gangster. He wasn't like Jerry Angulo. Jerry Angulo he never was out there in the street clipping and doing stuff like that. Jerry Angelo was just a gambler and had a great mind for numbers. He really wasn't a criminal. Like, in today's world where like gambling is basically, it is legal. You can download an app on your phone and put a first bets you put down what, like $5 for your first bet and it'll give you $100 credit or something. And it's like, it's so ridiculous. But what I'm saying is though, is Raymond, like he was, if you look at his resume from the crimes I'm describing here to you, I mean, this guy was involved in everything. But he was really into burglary. He liked breaking into places. He liked doing big scores. And so in the late 1930s, he got involved in some like really kind of infamous stuff. So he knocked over a Brighton, Mass payroll plant, and they actually like took some hostages and they cleaned it out for a bunch of money. And then very shortly after that, he was involved in a big jewelry store. I think it was called the Wall Bank Jewelry Store in Brookline, Massachusetts. And again, they they didn't really like take a hostage. They tied the people up and put them in the back so that they could get far away before the people would be able to get loose and call for help or report the burglary. They wanted to get some distance between themselves and the crime. So after these two pretty serious crimes, they tried to rob the United Optical plant in Webster, Mass. But while they were in there doing the crime, police showed up and boxed him in. And Raymond ended up having to come out with his hands up. He ended up getting arrested. And when they arrested him, they found a bag. And inside the bag, they said it was the most complete set of burglary tools that they'd ever seen in New England. That's how established of a burglar and a thief that Raymond was. And he really was. He was one of the top-notch thieves of like the time, I guess. And that's how he was making most of his money. But like I said, he was doing all different kinds of stuff. Like him and his brother, like I said, they violated the Mann Act. Like that's something that he was probably embarrassed of and wouldn't like to talk about later in life, because I don't think that that wasn't like a big moneymaker for the Patriarca family. I don't think that there was really any guys involved in pushing girls or running girls like that. That was kind of really frowned upon, just like drugs was. So anyway, so this is like really one of the most infamous things that happened with Raymond Patriarca. And this really adds to his legend about what a powerful personality and like the sway that he had and the connections that he could make, and just from meeting people and talking, and like he just had this power of personality, man. And it got him so far in the underworld and also with legitimate people as well. So after these crimes, he ends up he sees that he doesn't want to take it to trial. He doesn't want to get convicted for all three of these crimes and go away for a long time. So in 1938, he ends up pleading guilty, and he gets a sentence of 3 to 5 years at the medieval style awful prison in Charlestown, Mass. That I think in the 1960s maybe or 70s they finally got rid of it and stopped sending people there. But literally it was like a medieval dungeon in some castle. It was like an awful place to be. So Raymond went there. He was going to do his 3 to 5 year sentence, but his brother on the outside, his main compadre, his partner in crime, is writing letters to all these people, important people all over the state of Massachusetts, asking for help and say, help my brother out. He's a good man. He didn't, he's not what they're paying him out to be. He's not some violent criminal. Like, our mother is heartbroken, blah, blah, blah. And he's like reaching out to all these people. And so finally he gets a hold Daniel Coakley, who is a former Boston lawyer who's been disbarred, and he has been basically completely besmirched. He's ruined his reputation. He's been nicknamed the Knave of Boston. He is not very well liked, but he has crazy political connections, and he can make things happen, but of course for a price. So he goes and meets Raymond in jail, in prison, and he is just swooned by Raymond. He says that after meeting Raymond, he fell in love with the man. He thought he was just the greatest thing. This guy does not belong in prison. He belongs out on the street. He, could be such a productive citizen, such a productive member of society. Like, there's no reason that a man like this should be rotting in jail. He's a family man, all this stuff. So he ends up going to work for the Patriarchas, and he's tapping all his contacts. He's got all types of contacts in the Massachusetts State House. So they forged some letters. There's apparently 3 letters from supposed priests in Rhode Island that Raymond's very close with. One of them was a completely imaginary person. It was completely made up. And 2 of them were real priests. But all 3 of these were forged. None of these were actual real signatures. None of these priests sent these letters are forged anyways. So anyways, these letters and all this other paperwork and stuff ends up finding its way through the State House. Coakley had some sort of connection inside the governor's office with some guy who was very high up. 84 days into Raymond's 3 to 5 year sentence at the Charlestown State Prison, he was let go at 6 p.m. on December 22nd, 1938, a couple days before Christmas. He had been transported from the Charlestown prison to the Massachusetts State House. He had been signed the order of pardon by the Massachusetts State Governor at the time, and he was released. And he walked out of the Golden Dome Massachusetts State House a free man. Like, wow. So, like, this raised more than a couple eyebrows. People were in awe that Raymond had this type of power, I mean, it really kind of was like, wow, man, like this guy kind of went from being just kind of a 2-bit criminal gangster who is part of the Italian Mafia, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot at this time. But this brought him way up. This made people in the legitimate world notice him and say, who is this guy? Who has enough sway and power that he can get the Massachusetts governor to write him I don't know if it was like a stay of execution or a straight pardon or what it was, but 84 days into a 3 to 5 year sentence, he's a free man. So this made some people angry. And almost directly after he was released, Raymond married his longtime love of his life, his wife Helen, who her maiden name was Mancini, and apparently she was a Worcester nurse. I don't know how the 2 met, but it was the absolute love of Raymond's life. Like, he was so committed to his wife, and I've never read about Raymond having a gumar. I'm sure he probably did. I don't think there was a Mafia guy who didn't have a gumar. I think like it was part of like you had to have a gumar to be made. But like I've never really read about anything, and they always talk about how much he adored his wife and how Jerry Angulo was like shitting on him when Helen was sick and was like, "Oh, will she hurry up and die already so I don't want to hear Raymond crying about it anymore." You know, because he was upset when she was sick. And like anyway, so in 1939 they got married. She was 31 years old, and even the Massachusetts governor, Leverett Saltonstall, he declared that she was a mighty fine girl indeed. So I mean, I don't know if she was like just a very attractive girl or she was just a very sweet, nice girl. I'm sure it was a combination of all. I'm sure I just threw that in there because I feel like it's kind of important just as part of his character to like know that he was so devoted to his wife and loved his wife so much, when a lot of these guys were like womanizers, and I feel like their family was kind of like an afterthought. They were always out on the streets or at social clubs or at bars and with their multiple girlfriends anywhere but home. But like Raymond was like, from everything I've read, he was home like every night. He would do his business. He was at the Coinomac during the day, and then he was home at night, and he lived in a modest house right in Providence, and he loved his wife to the very end. It was one of those relationships like people are married forever, and then one of the spouses dies, and then like a year after the other spouse dies, because it's like almost like they die of a broken heart. But anyway, let's not get too deep into that kind of talk. So this like I said, raised a lot of eyebrows, made people angry. So him and Helen went and they honeymooned. They went on an extended honeymoon in Miami Beach. And Raymond, I think he did this because he knew that there was going to be heat in Massachusetts and people were going to be pissed about him getting this pardon. There was going to be a lot of questions asked, and it wasn't going to be just kind of like an open shut deal. So he's down there, and they end up like people start digging up anything they can find, and so they start digging up stuff, and they find an old auto theft charge from Cambridge. I don't know if it was a warrant or if it was like an old, he didn't show up or whatever, but they end up getting a warrant for this case, for this charge. They end up going down, arresting him in Miami, leaving a very, as described, distraught Helen behind. They had rented an apartment and they were living in Miami because they had been down there and extended. It was like a 5-month honeymoon they were on. He was definitely down there trying to evade. So they bring him back up. They ride on the train all the way from Miami. He rides back up with, I think it was U.S. Marshals and maybe a Boston detective or whatever. So they said Raymond was very polite on the train ride. He made some small talk, but most of all, he just looked out the window and watched the scenery for the most part. When they arrived at South Station, there was reporters everywhere, and they're harassing him, and Raymond turned so they couldn't see his face, and he was, scram! He was just like, he did not like the press. He did not like reporters. I wonder what Raymond would think about people like me making videos about stuff like this. I don't think he would have too much nice things to say. I think he'd tell me to scram, too. But so, like, all the reporters trying to get a word from him. So he ended up going back to prison, in 1940, this is 1939. He gets out in 1941 for the car theft charge, and as soon as he's released from jail, he's walking out of the court, and they rearrest him for an old charge, and he's screaming for his lawyer that, hey, they arrested me, what's going on? I'm supposed to be getting out of jail. So they send him back to prison, and now he's in there for another 3 years. He's there in 1944. So, I mean, the government they were bullshit about him getting that sentence commuted, and they basically made him go back to prison and redo the sentence. So he copped out to one of the robbery charges. I think it was the actual Webster one that they caught him red-handed, where they caught him with the bag full of all the burglar tools. And then when they brought him back on the car theft charge, he had to do a little skid bid a year for that. And then when he was getting released, they brought up the old charges. I think it was from the Brookline jewelry store, where he tied up the people who were working there and then made off with the jewelry. So basically, they were just like, listen, you screwed us and you got away from the 3 to 5 that you were supposed to do, and now we're going to jam this down your throat, and you're going to do those 3 years in prison. So they got him. So he got out in 1944, and supposedly he was supposed to be working at his brother-in-law, had a giant apple orchard in Johnston, Rhode Island. He was supposed to be doing a legitimate job helping him manage this apple orchard, but that's not what he did. He got right back into the rackets, and as soon as he got out of prison this time, I don't know if it's because he's a married man, or if he's getting older, if, the National Crime Syndicate had now at this point been established. Lucky Luciano had been deported, but the Crime Syndicate and the Commission and the 5 families had been developed, and it had been operating now for a good decade or so. And Raymond was very familiar with these guys. He had made connections with Frank Costello, who is now in charge of the Lucky Luciano Borgata and was one of the more powerful gangsters in New York City before Vito Genovese. Vito Genovese took control of the family and renamed it the Genovese Borgata. So, but he was very tight with Frank Costello, and Frank Costello was a politician, and he knew a lot of these other guys, and he was very close with Frank Icone, who was, even though he was kind of in Worcester, which wasn't it was kind of a backwater compared to a lot of these other cities, but he still was a very important person, and he knew all the right guys, and he was a powerful man. So he started to build his own team around him, and he chose Henry Tomiello, which was an old school gangster who was originally from Detroit but was around with New York City. I think he was part of the Lucchese family originally. Tell me if I'm wrong. I think he was originally an associate of the Lucchese family before Raymond kind of drafted him and had him come hang out with him in Providence and become kind of the emerging New England crime family. Louis the Fox Taglianetti, he was getting his own little team together down in Providence, and this was coinciding with the early 1950s with intense pressure from the U.S. government and the federal government, and that Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver was having his hearings, and they were pulling all the major mobsters from all over New England, all over the country, all the major cities, and they were pulling them in front of grand juries and asking them all these questions in front of the Senate committee hearings and stuff. And it was a bad time. And a lot of these old school, I've talked about in previous videos, so we don't need to talk too much about it. But this is from when Raymond became just another gangster and just another soldier in the Italian Mafia and became the Don, the Caesar, the Emperor of New England, and made that step because Joe Lombardo and Phil Buckler, who were in charge of the New England Mafia, who were based out of Boston, they had enough. Once they saw the intense pressure from the U.S. government and all these Senate hearings and grand juries and stuff, they saw the writing on the wall. They didn't want anything to do with it, and they both retired. And it just kind of left the door open for Raymond. And so on April 27th, 1952, at his old mentor and friend Frank Iacone's house in Worcester, Massachusetts, I believe Frank Costello and other top guys from New York City, maybe even people from farther away, who knows if maybe Carlos Marcello, maybe Santo Trafficante. I'm sure Angelo Bruno from Philadelphia was certainly there, probably Russell Bufalino. There was probably a lot of guys, these guys were in the 1950s. Absolutely, Angelo Bruno was in the 1950s, was in charge of Philadelphia. So I think like all the major guys from the East Coast, when they would have one of these ceremonies where a guy was being lifted up and being named the Don and being in charge of his own Borgata, like it was a very important thing. And I guess it wasn't a wicked smooth transition. There was a lot of going back and forth. And Raymond basically was like, let's just get this done. I don't care if I become boss. Like, I'm not going to hold anything against anybody. I just want to get this done and I want to get it solved and let's move on. Because he knew once he was given the title of boss, he knew what he was capable of and he knew he was going to get things in order. And in my opinion, Raymond Patriarca, he was the strongest, most powerful, most well-respected, just top mafia don in history. If anything, he would be second to Carlo Gambino. If anything, Carlo Gambino might have been, in his prime, the most premier, prominent mafia don in U.S. mafia history. But Raymond Patriarca would have been a close second. And, just because his playing field was not as grand and big as, say, New York City or Chicago, he had New England wrapped up. He moved the capital from Boston to the smaller Providence, and he reigned over that domain of New England, and the entire New England, except, east of the Connecticut River. The only thing he didn't have was the very far west part of Massachusetts and Connecticut. That was owned by the Genovese family, like the city of Springfield. But he had everything east of the Connecticut River, all the way through Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. He had all Massachusetts. He had Boston kissing his ring. You know what I mean? And he did this for over 3 decades, and he turned the New England Mafia into one of the most well-run, profitable, well-respected, feared organizations in the history of America, honestly. I mean, the Don Raymond and the New England Mafia, it should get as much attention as any of the New York families or the Chicago outfit or the Philly mob. I mean, they were just as powerful, just as profitable, and just as deadly. So this is just a story about, Raymond's early life and how the road he took, some of the highlights maybe that you weren't aware of, maybe you were. But like I said, I just want to do something a little different than we're talking about the Irish mob in Winter Hill in Charlestown. And just I haven't made a video about the Italian Mafia, and I haven't really talked about Raymond in a while, and I haven't really made a video ever about just Raymond. So he's definitely, he's the man. He's the Don, So I was happy to make this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I got to learn a little bit about how Raymond became, the Caesar of New England. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe. If you are not subscribed, leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought. Leave a request. Most of all, guys, like I always say, make good choices, make good decisions, take good care of yourselves, your family, your loved ones, your friends, your fellow humans. Have a great day. I will talk to you soon. God bless.